Edit audio.
This episode contains scenes of sexual violence and extreme violence. It may not be suitable for all listeners.
They thought somebody had seen a brown van, and then somebody had seen a green van, and somebody had seen a white van and a blue van. We had vans everywhere. And they were looking, and they were doing everything they could. And, they said, well, they'll be here sooner or later. And I said, I don't know, but whatever they do, you're going to have to find her or find her body. And I said, don't you quit looking until we do.
In the last episode of the Springfield Three,
the police I worked with were extremely stressed, and it was so stressful because nobody knew what was going on or why.
At this point in the case, the entire town of Springfield is buzzing about the disappearance of Stacy, Cheryl, and Suzie. The case has permeated the television sets and all circles in this town and beyond. Police officers have already received thousands of tips. The McCall family, that's Stacy's family, has a phone line that's dedicated to gathering information about the women.
And we had somebody staying at our house for about 3 weeks. They didn't leave our house. They would answer the phone because I started getting lots of weird phone calls. They were just weird in the way that they said they saw them and they were here or there or whatever.
In the last episode, we discussed the tip from the gas station clerk who said he saw the women that night. He said they were with a man in his early 30s with dark stringy hair and a mustache. The clerk said that the women left in separate cars, but friends of Stacy and Suzie, who were with them at multiple parties that night, say that the two never went to the gas station. And there was the tip that had come in from a waitress at George's Steakhouse, who reported seeing the women between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. She said that all 3 women had come in with 3 men and that Suzie appeared to be drunk. This tip, too, was dismissed. And truthfully, I could spend the rest of my adulthood talking about all of the tips that have been discussed over the years, but I'm trying to stick with the most relevant. The police and volunteers have searched surrounding areas. Divers have searched the shores and depths of Springfield Lake. Law enforcement and volunteers from the community searched the area on horseback. The Springfield Police Department was working nonstop and chasing thousands of leads.
And it was just a summer and a fall, but mostly that summer, of just chasing leads that went nowhere and having these suspicions that never panned out.
At this point, the Springfield Police Department started seriously looking into some theories and people of interest.
It could have been a serial killer. It could have been a friend of Cheryl's. It could have been a friend of Susie's. So you have this list of suspects that is endless.
This is the Springfield Three, a podcast about the disappearance of 3 women who forever changed a small Missouri town and the people in it. In the very early hours of the disappearance of Cheryl, Suzie, and Stacy, at approximately 6:30 a.m., there was a woman sitting out on her front porch. She explained to investigators that she saw a vehicle, a Dodge panel van that had a silver to greenish hue. The model looked to be from the mid-1960s to early 1970s. The woman said that the van was out of place and not a vehicle owned by any of the neighbors on the block. Most importantly, the woman said that there was a young woman in the driver's seat that appeared to be distressed. And there's not a whole lot of information on exactly how the woman in the driver's seat was described, but there's one detail that stands out. The woman in the van was said to have a birthmark on her cheek, and while you can't see it from the images, Suzie had a birthmark on her cheek that she often covered up with makeup. As it happens, a similar van was stolen on the night the women disappeared. Here's David Asher, one of the lead detectives on the case.
We had a lady on East McDaniel, further east of George's, that claimed she saw a van pull into her driveway operated by Suzie. And she heard a man's voice say, "Back up, get the hell out of here." And they did. So she called in. We interviewed her extensively. She was hypnotized to get the information or see if there was additional that she could recall.
According to reports, it was not until news broke that the witness made the call and told authorities that the female driver she saw was Suzie Streeter. It was another tip, but one that seemed viable. So the Springfield Police Department actually purchased a similar van and parked it in front of the police station, along with a phone number to contact the police for any tips and information. Robert Keyes was a lead reporter on the case at the time.
This van became a symbol of hope for solving the case, and the police department got a replica of this van, and I'll never forget, it was this lime green, it might have been a Dodge van, older model, like a 68 or something, and they just parked it in the front of the police department. Have you seen this van?
With this move from the police, traction in the case started picking back up. A paper carrier doing his deliveries at night described seeing a similar type of van, but it was brown. Over time, the color of the van changed, and it soon whittled down to sheer confusion without any new promising breaks regarding the vehicle. Ron Davis worked at the News Leader at the time.
Immediately, people were suspicious of anything that they thought didn't fit in the neighborhood. And so the idea that somebody was driving around, scoping it out in a van that would have drawn suspicion in a lot of neighborhoods seems a little far-fetched. That said, the van, police believed enough of it that they clearly made a dog and pony show out of it. I would have hated to have been driving a van like that at any point in the 6 months after the case, because you would have been stopped pretty much at every street corner. And despite that, they got nothing.
The News Leader report states that on June 20th, with no strong leads, police will focus on Cheryl's background and the theory of a transient abductor. So about Cheryl's background, we know that she was a model employee at a local hair salon, and while we don't have a ton of anecdotes about this woman, there's no evidence that said she had broken the law or was involved with drugs. We heard Nigel talk about how Cheryl was like a mother to her. And back when I started researching this case, I had a really long conversation with Cheryl's old boss, Joe Tate. Joe is the owner of New Attitudes Hair Salon. He met Cheryl while working at a different hair salon and then went on to open his own. It was Cheryl who helped influence him, and she became his first employee. He's now been in the same location for 30 years. Joe didn't want to be recorded talking about Cheryl. He told me that the rumors over the years have hurt him, but he kindly welcomed me to come by or call any time. He'd even show me her station, where they worked side by side. Joe said I could tell this story, so I'm going to tell you about her from my notes. Here's what Joe had to say about Cheryl Levitt. You'll hear snippets of our conversation, and because Joe didn't want to be recorded, you'll hear someone else reading the quotes I took down. Joe told me that Cheryl was meticulous with her work, and because of that, her clients were loyal. He told me that she was the type of person that would send a card for a birthday or when someone died or if a client was sick. She liked to have cookies at the shop, and she always had her clients' coffee ready. He also told me that she was fun to be around. Cheryl would laugh until she cried. Joe told me that over the years he's heard horrible rumors, often involving Cheryl and drugs. In fact, he said that a police officer once asked him if she was a known cocaine dealer. He told me,
I just about fell over when I heard that.
He said Cheryl's idea of a wild night would be to go out for a nice dinner, maybe a glass of wine, and go home and crash. He said that she was an excellent mother and really determined to get Suzie through school and point her in the right direction. And then Joe got sort of sad. He said,
It's hard to believe. I'll never forget the Monday morning. The phone rang and it was Mrs. McCall, and she asked me if Cheryl was there. I couldn't believe it.
He was then interviewed by the FBI and the police. He mentioned the cash that was left in Cheryl's purse and said that as a hairdresser, they have bank deposit bags in the drawer and that $900 in cash is really normal. Joe remembered everything, like that Cheryl took checks and cash from customers because they didn't have a credit card machine back then. They still don't. He said that the police took everything from her appointment book to her credit card file. When I asked Joe if he had a theory as to what happened, he told me that he thought it was odd that 3 people could just disappear like that. He said to me,
I think that the person who did it held them at knife or gunpoint. I know Cheryl would have been made to leave. With her cigarettes, purse, bank bag, she was a very responsible person.
He also said that he always thought that whatever happened was because of Stacy and Suzie and not connected to Cheryl in any way. He said,
In my mind, I visually see them in traffic, See a car at guys, maybe they follow them home. There are a lot of unanswered questions.
This was just part of the conversation I had with Joe, but the most important. I sat on my mother's bed while we talked on the phone. He sounded older, but incredibly passionate about his work. He also sounded like, after all these years, that he still really missed his friend. Before we hung up and made plans for me to visit the shop, Joe said,
"If I get to heaven, Cheryl and I will have a long talk. She has some explaining to do."
Ron Davis remembers driving by the Delmar house and noticing the effort that Cheryl put into her home.
She was, by all accounts, a really hard worker. It wasn't like she was losing a lot of time being strung out or anything. 1717 East Delmar is right on the edge of a really nice neighborhood. Country Club Estates is what it was called. So this was really nice, and she spent a lot of time and effort really revamping her modest home. Every time I drove past there for years afterwards, I would just notice the hemerocallis, the daylilies out front in the circle drive. And that's what I always remembered about that time, was that they were in full bloom.
So maybe the rumors about Cheryl weren't true. They were rumors after all, and we have no evidence to back them up. But what we do have are more theories that point to people in Cheryl and Suzie's life. Specifically, Suzie's ex-boyfriend Dustin Rekla and his friends Michael Clay and Joseph Riedel. A disclaimer here. I don't know if I'm pronouncing these names correctly. I tried reaching out to Dustin and Michael, but I never heard back. It's reported that while Suzie and Dusty were in a relationship, he, along with Joseph and Michael, were arrested and charged with vandalism on February 21st, 1992. That's just a few months before the women went missing. An arrest for robbery is unfortunate, but maybe it's not out of the ordinary for a few young men. But the reason that they were arrested is seriously unsettling. Michael, Dustin, and Joseph were accused of breaking into a mausoleum and stealing gold fillings from a corpse's mouth. Shortly after, friends of Suzie's confirmed that she had broken up with Dustin and provided a statement to the police about this crime. Dustin and Michael were released pending trial, and it was said that Suzie was nervous as to whether or not she'd have to testify in a court case. Following this lead, acquaintances of Dustin and Michael came forward to state that they had heard the two men wishing Suzie dead. In particular, hearing Michael say, "I wish all three of the women were dead." Dustin and Michael were called in for questioning and were let go due to lack of evidence. The two men have never been apprehended or charged with the disappearance. They're still considered suspects to this day. Laura Bauer is a journalist now for the Kansas City Star, but she worked at the Springfield News Leader for years and was the crime reporter for most of that time.
There were others who believed that Suzie's ex-boyfriend and his friends who were into satanic rituals and grave robbing would have been involved. According to the people I'd interviewed, they thought that they had a motive at the time because she was going to testify. You know, as a reporter, you track these down and you don't know what to believe. I mean, all you know is there are all these theories out there.
And then there's Suzie's brother. During the investigation into Cheryl's background, the police learned that she had a son, Bart Streeter, who was 9 years older than his sister Suzie. It's believed that in the early 1980s, Cheryl had given Bart an ultimatum that led to him leaving home.
Suzie's brother, Bart, was a strong suspect. And I spent a lot of time with him that summer. And, you know, Bart was just a mess. You know, his mother and sister were gone. And Bart had already lived a pretty tough life. You know, his father, I think, had some, was estranged from the family. And, Bart was just a kid who grew up with a lot of problems. And now he had another really big problem, which was his mother and sister were just gone, and he was being eyed as a suspect.
In the fall of 1991, Bart returned to Springfield. Apparently, he'd been through a difficult breakup with his girlfriend and had returned to Springfield to make it right with his mom and sister. On Thursday, June 11th, Bart Streeter passed a polygraph test. Since the three women have disappeared, Bart has had a smattering of trouble with the law. Stuff like public intoxication or disorderly conduct. But it begs the question, if your mother and sister were taken in the middle of the night and you never got to say goodbye, how would this affect you? Add to that you were accused of their disappearance.
I mean, I saw Bart recently had an incident where he was accused of some sort of, it sounded like he was intoxicated or under the influence or something. And I think, is that just one of the ripples that happens when something like that happens to your life and you're a young man? Is the rest of your life destined to be tragic things because you can't get over it?
After diving into a serious internet true crime wormhole, I found Bart. It seems that he's active in an online forum. And there's also a blog, which appears to be run by Bart, called the Streeter Family Blog, dedicated to finding the 3 women. I tried contacting Bart multiple times, but it appears that he doesn't have much interest in the media, which is too bad, really. In reporting on this story, I was able to speak with Janis and Brenda and Heather and others about Stacy. But besides Joe and Nigel, it's been hard to find people to speak on behalf of Suzie and Cheryl. So now a little more about that wormhole. True crime junkies are deeply obsessed with this disappearance. It's 3 beautiful women who disappeared without a trace, virtually vanished. There are Facebook groups dedicated to the crime, subreddits, and forums. And there are some seriously wild and possibly even valid theories about the women. Due to the nature of this disappearance, where the women appear to just vanish out of thin air, alien abduction has been thrown around. It's something I even heard as a kid from my own mother.
People became obsessed with it because, it's like, where are they? And there was rumors that they had been kidnapped and taken overseas. I mean, it was just that aliens took them. I mean, it was just crazy.
And it's funny you mentioned the alien theory. It's almost as if they were just vanished out of there. Everything left behind.
There were some weird theories. I wrote, I believe at the 10-year anniversary, about a meeting where somebody had said, well, what about UFOs? What about extraterrestrial? And everybody was like, are you kidding?
But possibly the most popular theory I've heard my entire life is that the women are buried under a parking lot. And there are 2 stories here, because there's not just one parking lot, but 2. The first involves a massive Western store called PFI that's owned by a prominent Springfield businessman. PFI Western Store started in 1975 as this dusty livestock feed and farm supply business located on Springfield's northwest side of town. What began as a modest feed store turned into a massive business when the owners bought the Western wear clothing store next door. In 1993, the owner relocated the store off US 65, an area where you'd find not much else but a highway and land. The 30,000-foot retail center sells over 15,000 styles of cowboy boots, and more than 300 saddles are always on display. You'll find everything there from taxidermy bobcats to a conceal and carry section that helps to style those who carry a handgun. It's not unusual to see a horse in the parking lot, and Kenny Rogers once sent a limo to PFI to pick up 15 pairs of cowboy boots. An old newspaper article states that the owner of PFI announced plans for his new store in mid-November of 1992, with construction to begin in December. The store opened in 1993. At this point, the women had been missing for nearly half a year. Is it even possible that they could be buried there? And then there's the second parking lot theory, possibly the most infamous theory to come out of this disappearance. And that is that the women are buried under the Cox South Hospital parking garage. I heard this theory my entire life, and it's still thrown around by people in the community today. And to be clear, these are 2 different parking lots that presumably have nothing to do with one another.
That's another theory that people talk about, that it's possible that, their bodies could have been placed in a construction area that was covered with cement.
I always heard the theories, some would call them rumors, that the women were buried the property where PFI stands or at Cox South Hospital.
Cox South Hospital began construction in 1981 and was completed in 1985. I was born at Cox North Hospital, but my youngest brothers were both born at Cox South. I've visited many friends and family here, and I even had my appendix taken out at Cox South in 2004. It's located just down the street from my mom and grandma's apartment complex. In a nutshell, everyone in this town and outside of it knows or has likely been to Cox South Hospital. Investigators received a tip that the women's bodies were buried in the foundations of the south parking garage at Cox Hospital. In 2007, crime reporter Kathy Baird brought attention to the case. And if you've read anything about the Springfield Three, you're bound to run across the name Kathy Baird. She's a freelance reporter and blogger who claimed to have received a tip, often said to be from a psychic, that the 3 women were buried under a hospital parking lot. A lot of locals believe this theory. There's even an online petition titled, quote, "Petition to dig up the Cox Hospital South parking structure in search of the Springfield Three!" Exclamation point. It has over 1,700 digital signatures. So a lot of people believe this theory. But then again, in talking to people about this case, some are critical of Kathy Baird's methods and have said that she's basically full of it. Either way, Baird invited a mechanical engineer to scan a corner of the parking lot with ground-penetrating radar. The engineer found 3 anomalies, roughly of the same size, that he said were consistent with a gravesite location. 2 of the anomalies were parallel, and the other was perpendicular. David Asher talks about it.
What would you call her? I wouldn't call her a witch. I would call her a clairvoyant. Said that they were buried under a parking garage east of Cox Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri. And she got a guy to come there with a ground radar, and they checked the area, and they thought they saw 3 objects in the ground that could potentially be bodies.
Police spokesperson Lisa Cox said that the person who reported the tip, quote, provided no evidence or logical reasoning behind this theory at the time or since then, unquote. She also said that the parking garage began construction in September of 1993, over a year after the disappearance.
That building wasn't even there for 2 years after the women disappeared. So I find it highly unlikely that they would be buried there. But I will say Cox Medical Center offered to let them dig it up there in that parking garage to find out if there is anything there. But because it was a clairvoyant that came up with this idea, I just don't think they wanted to risk spending a lot of time and money for nothing.
The Springfield Police Department looked into this theory and found it was not credible. They never requested that the parking garage concrete be destroyed to search underneath it. Here's David Milsap, who took over the case years after the disappearance.
I can tell you that the rumor of being buried at Cox and all that type of stuff is just, again, that information that gets out there and runs rampant on the internet that has no basis of truth. The person that threw the information out there about the bodies being buried at the parking lot on Cox Hospital, we interviewed her, and the story of how that comes back comes from a psychic, and really has been a discredit to this investigation that rumor was even put out there.
Laura Bauer didn't do much reporting on the Cox South parking lot theory, but remembers the community rallying around the demand for the dig.
I think it was difficult for some people with the whole Cox parking lot, because why won't they dig? If it's true, if it could be a possibility, why won't they do it? And I think people in the community really got into that.
Most of the people we've talked to throughout this series have said similar things about the parking lot theories, that they just don't seem plausible. Here's Ron Davis again.
Well, if they would have done sounding over the entire parking garage, I mean, the Ozarks is notorious for its karst topography. There are sinkholes everywhere. You're going to have anomalies in the earth, especially under a construction site where people throw trash and debris as they pour concrete. So if you do soundings in one area, you're going to find things that look weird. And if you did that 100 yards from there, you're going to find things that look weird. But you can't just dig up 6 feet of soil and rock everywhere. But, I look at some of these theories, like the Cox parking lot theory, would require that somebody held the bodies for several months before they were able to dump them in a parking lot with nobody noticing. That just doesn't really seem, because again, you would have to think that everybody else was either asleep or blind, or just not paying attention when you're moving the corpses of 3 people into an active construction site where there are lights on 24/7 and crews moving. That's just not really going to happen.
I reached out to Kathy Baird multiple times, and she declined to do an interview for this podcast. So we've heard about the van theory and the parking lot theories, but perhaps the most chilling theory would be the Camp Winoka sighting. Camp Winoka is located on the shores of Lake Springfield at the interchange of Highway 60 and 65. When I was growing up, we called it the Girl Scout Camp. Legend has it that it's an old Girl Scout camp where a group of Girl Scouts were brutally murdered. This is where teenagers from all around Springfield would go during high school, basically to scare the hell out of ourselves. My friends and I went there often, mostly because there wasn't much else to do on a Saturday night. And I remember it well, probably because it was so scary to me. There were abandoned stone buildings, a fireplace, an old in-ground swimming pool, and it was deep in the woods and it was dark. But as it turns out, this was not the location of a Girl Scout camp, but the grounds of the Winoka Lodge, a hunting lodge once owned by Springfield's Schweitzer family. A fire destroyed it in 1977. As for the Girl Scout murder, on June 13th of 1977, 3 young Girl Scouts were abducted and murdered at Camp Scott. But it was in Locust Grove, Oklahoma. The murders remain unsolved to this day. And while I'd been to this wooded area many times in my teens, it's never been a part of the 3 missing women's thread, until I met Barrett Fisk.
My name is Barrett Fisk. I'm from Springfield, Missouri, and I am a born and raised here Springfieldian and always lived here Springfieldian. One of the ones that never left, so I had to stay around to play amateur detective, I guess.
Barrett reached out to me via email after I had made a post in an online forum seeking out information on this case. As it turns out, he's the older brother of one of my dear friends who I mentored in New York City. He went to the same high school as my husband, and his parents own the limo company in our town. A few days later, Barrett sent me an anonymous blog post from Crime Scene Investigates. The post is graphic and sad, and out of respect to the families, I'm going to paraphrase it. The blog post is from a 15-year-old boy from Fort Worth, Texas, who was visiting family in Missouri. One night he snuck out with his friend Chuck, who took him to the Girl Scout camp. He says that the chain of events that happened about 4 a.m. has haunted him his entire life. The post states that a van came out of nowhere while he and his friend were deep in the woods.
This van comes out of nowhere. 3 guys get out. They've got 3 women. The women are terrified.
So the kid and his friend quickly hid. He estimated about 50 or 60 yards away, but it was close enough to see the 3 men and the 3 women from the glow of the headlights. He said that he'd never forget their voices. He felt as if they were right next to him.
They were watching from a distance. It was dark. The perpetrators didn't see them.
He said that the women were begging and screaming and sounded terrified. He claimed to have heard one being killed, and the other 2 were raped and beaten. And then he said that there was silence, and he heard them being loaded into the van.
The women were taken and loaded back into the van.
He and his friends stayed in the woods for what he estimated to be 4 hours until the van left just before daylight broke. They didn't want to make any noise. The anonymous person wrote this in 2013 when he was 36 years old and claims that this event has haunted him his entire life. And it must have haunted his friend Chuck too, because he took his own life shortly after this happened.
What's interesting is there are so many things on the internet or on podcasts or wherever about this where someone is trying to present a suspect or someone is trying to say where they think these women have been buried. This post doesn't say either of those things. They're not trying to assert what everyone else is trying to assert. That's what also made me think there's something a little bit genuine to this.
Barrett took this information to the police, and while this theory may be new, it seems to have some legs. Here's Darrell Moore, who was the chief assistant prosecuting attorney in Greene County at the time. Have you heard, or can you say anything, if you have heard, about a theory of the women being taken to Camp Winoka?
Well, I don't want to get into. I have heard that theory. I will tell you that it's interesting.
In the next episode of the Springfield Three, we look at some of the main suspects that emerge in this case, some of whom are known serial killers, and one who claims to know exactly where the 3 women are buried.
And I'm thinking, if there were other people who were more of a suspect living in Springfield during that time, I'd like to know who they are, but that's a really strong suspect in my view. That's the kind of person who has the makings of a serial killer.
The Springfield Three is an Edit Audio original production created in collaboration with Ann Roderick Jones. The series is written, researched, and hosted by Ann Roderick Jones. It was produced and edited by Ali Sirwa, with executive producing from Steph Colburn, Sophie Shin, and with lots of help from the rest of the amazing Edit Audio team. Theme music was written by Patrick Rindle and Ali Sirwa and was produced by Patrick Rindle at Studio Dolly. And thank you to all of those who share their stories with us. This project would not be possible without you.